They say every mystery leaves behind a trace, a bloodstain, a broken watch, a name scrawled in dust. But some stories leave only questions. Some stories never end. They echo through police files and gravestones. A body found without a killer, a person who vanished without a sound, a whisper in the dark that shouldn't be there. These are the cases too strange for logic, too chilling for comfort, and too twisted to forget. They are riddles left behind by the dead and the living who can't let go. Welcome to Whispers After Dark, where the shadows talk and the night listens. Some stories don't begin with a scream. They begin with a whisper, a creaking floorboard in the dead of night, a soft thud in the attic above your bed, a footprint where no one should be. Not every haunting needs a ghost, and not every monster leaves when the sun comes up. Sometimes they stay. It was March 31st, 1922, in rural Bavaria, Germany, on a lonely farmstead tucked between the villages of Ingolstadt and Schrobenhausen. The place was called Hinterkaifeck. It wasn't a real village, just a nickname for a remote farm that sat deep in the woods, far from neighbors and even farther from help. The farm was home to Andreas Gruber, a harsh 63-year-old man, his wife Cecilia, their widowed daughter Victoria, Victoria's 2 children, 7-year-old Cecilia and 2-year-old Josef, and a maid named Maria Baumgartner, who had just arrived for her first day of work. She would not survive the night. 6 people lived on the Hinterkaifeck farm. By the next morning, every one of them was dead. But it wasn't just the murder that chilled Germany to the bone. It was everything that happened before. In the days leading up to the massacre, Andreas Gruber had noticed something strange. Footprints in the snow leading from the edge of the forest straight to the farmhouse, but no prints leading away. He searched the property, locked the doors, checked the barn. He found nothing. Then the sounds began. He told neighbors he heard footsteps in the attic at night, but when he searched, there was no one there. A newspaper appeared in the kitchen, one they didn't subscribe to. Keys went missing. Mysterious scratches showed up on the tool shed. The family began to feel watched. Still, Andreas never contacted the police, and maybe deep down, he knew there was no point. On March 31st, night fell. One by one, members of the family were lured into the barn. No one knows why. Maybe they heard something. Maybe they saw someone. Whatever it was, they went willingly. They were each murdered with a mattock, a tool similar to a pickaxe, struck in the head, their skulls crushed. No screams were heard. No one escaped. Then the killer moved inside. The maid, Maria Baumgartner, was killed in her room. 2-year-old Josef was murdered in his crib. 6 lives ended. Not in a rage, not in haste, but methodically, quietly, as if someone had all the time in the world. And then, the most disturbing part of all, the killer stayed. Over the next 4 days, smoke was seen rising from the chimney. The cows were fed, the dog was tied up in the barn, someone had cooked meals in the kitchen. They slept there, ate there, lived there, inside the house of the people they had just slaughtered. Days passed before anyone checked on the family. When the mailman noticed their deliveries piling up, and the children failed to appear at school, neighbors went to the farm to investigate. What they found in the barn stunned even seasoned investigators. The bodies of Andreas, his wife, Victoria, and 7-year-old Cecilia were stacked on top of each other, covered in hay. Inside the house, Maria and Josef were found where they'd been killed. Victoria's face was unrecognizable. Joseph's skull had been smashed, and little Cecilia, just 7 years old, had torn clumps of hair from her head before she died. It wasn't just a murder. It was something darker, something cruel. Police searched the property and found the murder weapon hidden in the attic, the very attic the family had heard footsteps in days before. And yet, despite dozens of interviews, investigations, and even a full reconstruction of the crime in 2007, no one has ever been arrested. No motive has ever been proven. The victims' heads were removed and sent to Munich for examination. But in a final twist, the skulls were lost, vanished before they could be buried. No one knows where they are. The Hinterkaifeck farmhouse was torn down the following year. All that remains is a memorial stone. The land itself has long been abandoned. The case remains unsolved. No footprints leading away, no suspects, no justice. Just 6 people, one silent attic, and a trail of horror that still haunts Germany to this day. They say evil always leaves a trace, but in Hinterkaifeck, it didn't leave a single one behind. Christmas should be a season of peace, time spent with family, traditions, but for the Lawson family, it ended with murder. Our next story is Christmas with the Dead. Some families gather for joy, some for tradition, but once, in the hills of North Carolina, a family gathered for something else. Not to celebrate the season, but to die by it. Because evil doesn't wait for the dark. And on December 25th, 1929, it wore the face of a father. Charles Davis Lawson was a hard-working man. He was 43 years old, a tobacco farmer in Germantown, North Carolina. By all accounts, he was quiet but respectable. He and his wife Fanny had 7 children: Marie, Arthur, Carrie, Maybelle, James, Raymond, and little Mary Lou. The Lawsons had just posed for a family portrait. New clothes, clean faces. Some said it was odd for a working-class family to spend so much on formal photos. But Charles had insisted. What no one knew at the time was that Charles had already decided to kill them. On Christmas morning, while the rest of the country opened presents and shared meals, Charles Lawson sent his eldest son, 19-year-old Arthur, on a mysterious errand into town. Some say it was for ammunition. Others say it was just a distraction. But whatever it was, Arthur would be the only one to survive. While he was gone, Charles waited near the tobacco barn. He watched as his 2 daughters, Carrie, age 12, and Maybelle, age 7, walked down the path toward their uncle's house. He ambushed them, shooting one instantly and bludgeoning the other. He then carried their bodies back to the barn and laid them side by side, crossing their arms over their chests as if they were sleeping. Then he returned to the house. Inside, he shot his wife Fanny as she sat on the porch. His daughter Marie, just 17 years old, screamed from inside the home. He went in and shot her next. His 2 young sons, James and Raymond, tried to hide, but he found them too. And then finally, there was Mary Lou. The baby, just 4 months old. Some believe he crushed her skull with the butt of his rifle. Others say it was done with his bare hands. When it was over, 6 children and 1 mother were dead. Charles placed each body carefully. Some in the barn, some in the house. Their arms were folded, rocks were placed beneath their heads, as if to grant them comfort in death he never gave them in life. Then he disappeared into the woods. Hours passed. Arthur returned home to a nightmare no boy should ever see. As word spread, neighbors gathered. A search party formed. They found Charles in the forest, dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. He had left behind letters, notes scribbled in a barely legible hand. But there was no clear explanation, no confession, just one message written in pencil on the wall of the barn. Trouble can cause. The rest trailed off. Rumors exploded. Some whispered that Charles had suffered a head injury months earlier. Others believed he was plagued by financial strain. The most disturbing theory came years later, suggesting Charles may have been hiding a dark family secret, one that pushed him into a spiral of guilt and rage. But officially, no motive was ever confirmed. The why remains a mystery. And Arthur? He lived, but he never truly escaped it. He died in a car crash just 16 years later. The Lawson home became a grim tourist attraction. Bloodstains still soaked the floors. Visitors paid a dime to step inside the death house and look evil in the face. To this day, no one can say what really drove Charles Lawson to slaughter his family on Christmas Day. There was no rage, no warning, no known illness, just silence, and a family photo frozen in time. They say the holidays bring people together, but in Germantown, 1929, it tore one family apart forever. Only once in American history has a ghost taken the witness stand, and her name was Zona Heister. This is the story of the Greenbrier Ghost. They say the dead can't speak, that once breath leaves the body, all secrets go with it. But what if that isn't true? What if just once a voice slipped through the veil, not in whispers, but in full accusation, loud enough to shake the living and strong enough to convict a killer? In the quiet hollows of Greenbrier County, West Virginia, the mountains keep secrets the way trees keep shadows. It was 1897, a place where superstition and scripture often walked hand in hand, and sometimes something else walked beside them. Elva Zona Heister was spirited, bright, and just a little unconventional for the expectations of her time. She had a strong will and a quick smile, the kind of woman who didn't always follow rules the way people expected her to. When she met Edward Shue, a blacksmith who'd recently moved into town, she seemed instantly taken. He was tall, handsome, polite, quiet. They married quickly, too quickly, some said, but Zona looked happy. For a little while at least, it seemed the hills had given her a fresh start. That illusion shattered on a cold January morning. A neighbor's boy, running errands for Edward, found Zona lying at the foot of the stairs in their home. Her arms were stiff and folded oddly across her chest. Her eyes were wide open, glassy, frozen in an expression of terror, and her neck tilted at an unnatural angle. Edward was already there when the doctor arrived, weeping loudly, rocking Zona's body in his arms. He wouldn't let anyone near her, not the doctor, not neighbors, not even her mother. When Dr. George Knapp finally managed a brief look, Shue hovered so closely that he couldn't perform a proper examination. Out of discomfort or maybe fear, Dr. Knapp declared it a natural death. Everlasting faint, he called it at first. Later he changed it to complications from pregnancy. No autopsy was ordered. Zona was buried the very next day. But not everyone was so easily convinced, especially not Mary Jane Heister, Zona's mother. Mary Jane had never liked Edward Shue. She said from the start there was something cold in his eyes, something calculating just beneath the surface. At the funeral, that suspicion turned to dread. Edward had dressed Zona's body himself, which was highly unusual. He wrapped a thick scarf around her neck and placed a rolled cloth beneath her head in the coffin. When someone tried to touch her, he snapped, angry, volatile, protective of her corpse in a way that didn't feel like grief. Mary Jane went home with a storm in her chest. She prayed, she pleaded, and then Zona came. For 4 nights in a row, Mary Jane claimed her daughter appeared to her, not quite in a dream, not quite awake, something in between. Zona stood at the foot of her bed, pale and trembling, angry and broken. "Mama," she whispered, "he killed me." Each night the vision became clearer. Zona told her mother what happened, how Edward had come home in a rage, how he flew into a fury when she didn't have meat for his supper. That it wasn't the first time he'd hurt her, but this time it was different. He grabbed her by the neck, twisted, snapped it clean. On the final night, as Zona turned to leave, her head rotated fully around, showing her neck broken between the first and second vertebrae. Mary Jane woke gasping. She knew what she had to do. With fire in her spine, she marched to the local prosecutor. She told him everything. Not just the suspicions, but the visits, the ghost, the broken neck. She demanded Zona's body be exhumed. Whether it was her persistence or something in her voice that made the prosecutor's skin crawl, he agreed. In secret, Zona's body was unearthed and a full autopsy performed. This time, Dr. Knapp examined her thoroughly. What he found was chilling. Her windpipe had been crushed, ligaments torn. Finger-shaped bruises ringed her neck, inflicted before death. And at the base of her skull, her neck had been snapped clean, just as her mother claimed. Edward Shue was arrested, and when his past unraveled, so did any image of innocence. He'd been married twice before, one wife mysteriously dead, the other driven away in terror, calling him violent and controlling. At trial, the prosecution presented the facts. the autopsy, the pattern of abuse, and Edward's strange behavior. But what the jury remembered was Mary Jane. She took the stand in front of a packed courtroom and told them, calm, unwavering, that her daughter's ghost had revealed the truth. People scoffed, some gasped, but others leaned in closer, and when the jury left to deliberate, it took them just over an hour to return with their verdict: guilty. Edward Shue was sentenced to life in prison. He died a few years later, unrepentant, alone, forgotten by the world. But Zona was never forgotten. Today in Greenbrier County, a historic marker stands not far from her grave. It reads, "This is the only known case in which testimony from a ghost helped convict a murderer." So whether you believe in spirits or not, one thing is certain: sometimes the dead do speak, and when they do, they demand to be heard. Our next story takes us to New Brunswick, New Jersey, 1922. This is the Hall Mills murders. They say the loudest secrets are the ones buried just beneath polite smiles and polished shoes, that sometimes the most devout hands are the ones most soaked in sin. In 1922, the quiet town of New Brunswick, New Jersey, was shaken by a scandal so lurid, so grotesque, it made national headlines and stained the steps of a church in blood. Not just because two people were murdered, but because someone wanted it to be seen. All of it. And someone wanted the truth to die with them. Reverend Edward Wheeler Hall was the kind of man the townsfolk trusted. Clean-shaven, soft-spoken, a man of the cloth with careful manners and a perfect wife. He preached kindness, he offered counsel, he stood at the altar every Sunday, and he was having an affair. Her name was Eleanor Mills. She sang in the choir. She had a husband, too, a quiet janitor at the church. But Eleanor was different. She had longing in her voice and secrets in her eyes, and Edward gave her something to long for. Their affair was whispered about in back pews and behind lace curtains, but no one said it out loud. Not until the morning their bodies were found. It was September 16th, 1922. A young couple, out for a walk near a secluded field, discovered the scene. Beneath a crabapple tree lay two corpses, arranged like a twisted shrine to forbidden love. Eleanor's throat had been slashed so deeply she was nearly decapitated. Her tongue was missing. Edward had been shot once through the head. His right arm was stretched beneath her neck, cradling her in death as though in a final, grotesque embrace. Around them, pages of torn love letters were scattered like confetti. Personal, passionate, damning. The reaction was instant. Newspapers labeled it the crime of the century. Reporters swarmed the town. What might have been a quiet scandal became a national sensation, and all eyes turned to one woman, Frances Hall, Edward's widow. Elegant, wealthy, cold. She moved through the firestorm with eerie calm, dressed in black silk, untouched by grief. Alongside her stood her two brothers, William and Henry Stevens. Wealthy, reclusive, known for keeping things quiet. It didn't take long for whispers to turn into accusations, that Frances had discovered the affair, that she and her brothers had followed Edward and Eleanor to the orchard, that what happened beneath that tree wasn't a crime of passion, but punishment, cold, calculated punishment. But for 4 years, the case stalled. Witnesses changed their stories, evidence went missing, some even disappeared altogether. And when charges were finally filed, it was already too late. The trial was a circus. Testimony was weak. Memories were fuzzy. Frances never faltered. Her voice never cracked. The jury deliberated for less than a day. All three, Frances and her brothers, walked free. No one else was ever arrested. And the truth, whatever it was buried alongside Edward and Eleanor. But if you ask the locals, those who've lived there long enough, they'll tell you the orchard never quite recovered, that nothing grows the same near that crabapple tree, that animals won't go near it, and that sometimes, if the wind is still and the night is quiet, you can hear voices, not screams, not cries, just whispers. 2 of them, soft and pleading, saying the same thing over and over. Tell them what happened. Someone must know, someone must speak. but no one ever did, and maybe no one ever will. They say identical twins share everything, but does that include madness? Our next story explores the strange but true story of the Erickson twins. They didn't run from danger, they ran into it. In the middle of a busy motorway, two identical sisters stepped into traffic, again and again, as if death couldn't touch them. No warning, no drugs, no explanation, just chaos, and a mystery that only gets stranger the deeper you go. In May 2008, on the busy M6 motorway in England, traffic cameras captured something bizarre. Two women darting across lanes of oncoming traffic. Cars swerved, horns blared, and then, with horrifying calm, they stepped directly into the path of speeding vehicles. The twins, Ursula and Sabina Erickson, Swedish nationals, were traveling through the UK for reasons never fully explained. Earlier that day, they were removed from a London-bound bus after erratic behavior. The driver said they were clutching their bags, whispering to each other, and acting paranoid, like they were being followed. Eventually, police and medics arrived after the motorway incident. Despite severe injuries from being hit by vehicles, Ursula became aggressive, spitting, screaming, resisting all help. Sabina, though slightly less injured, was dazed but calm for the moment. Just as things settled, Sabina suddenly bolted. She sprinted back into traffic and was struck head-on by another car. Miraculously, she survived. While restrained and loaded into an ambulance, she repeatedly muttered, "They're going to steal your organs, and I know they're not real." Police assumed drug use, but toxicology reports? Completely clean. No alcohol, no drugs, nothing, and no history of mental illness, at least none on record. But the nightmare wasn't over. After just 5 hours of observation, Sabina was released from custody. She calmly thanked the officers, apologized for the inconvenience, and disappeared into the streets of Stoke-on-Trent. The next day, she was spotted by a local man named Glenn Holinshed, a kind-hearted 54-year-old who offered her a place to stay. He said she seemed odd, but not dangerous. She told him she was looking for her sister and had fled from bad people. That night, he cooked her dinner. She thanked him. The following morning, without warning or provocation, Sabina stabbed Glenn 5 times with a kitchen knife. He staggered outside, calling for help before collapsing and dying on the front steps. Sabina fled the scene, hitting herself with a hammer as she ran, and later jumped from a 40-foot bridge. She survived. At trial, her defense claimed temporary insanity. Psychiatrists diagnosed her with folie à deux, a rare psychiatric syndrome where delusional beliefs are shared between close individuals, especially twins. The sisters had reportedly been inseparable, and it's believed Ursula's delusions had infected Sabina's fragile mental state. Sabina served only 5 years for manslaughter. To this day, the full motive remains unknown. Ursula returned to Sweden. Sabina vanished after her release. There are no solid answers. Only questions. Why did they believe they were being hunted? What caused 2 seemingly normal women to suddenly spiral into violence and psychosis? And perhaps most chilling of all, what really happened before they stepped into traffic that day? Have you ever heard of a place that was built for death? Something so evil that its presence still haunts the place it used to be? This is the story of the H.H. Holmes murder castle. A house that breathed death, and even though the walls have crumbled, the screams still echo. Welcome to the murder castle. In Chicago's Inglewood neighborhood, just beyond the glow of the 1893 World's Fair, there once stood a building unlike any other. It was designed to look like a hotel, but it wasn't. It was a trap. Built by a man named H.H. Holmes, it was meant to confuse, to disorient, and to kill. Staircases led to brick walls. Doors opened to nowhere. Some rooms were airtight chambers with hidden gas jets. Others had peepholes and chutes that dropped straight to the basement, where lime pits, surgical tables, and furnaces waited. It was called many things: a hotel, a boarding house, a pharmacy. But history would remember it as one thing: the murder castle. It rose on a quiet corner in Chicago's Inglewood neighborhood, just before the 1893 World's Fair. Thousands came to the city for adventure, for hope, for work, and for many this strange hotel was their last stop. You see, the castle was a maze, designed by Holmes himself, built by workers who were constantly fired and replaced so no one ever saw the full blueprint. Staircases that led to nowhere. Doors that opened to brick walls. A room with no windows and no exit. Trapdoors. Peepholes. Gas lines hidden in the walls. This was not a hotel. It was a labyrinth of death. Holmes advertised for young women seeking work. He charmed them, promised them jobs, lodging, safety. Some were last seen entering the building. None were seen leaving. Inside the castle, Holmes had rooms he called the Vault. Soundproof, airtight. He would watch from hidden panels as his victims screamed. Then, when the air ran out, he'd send their bodies down a secret chute to the basement, where a dissecting table and lime pits waited. Bones were sold to medical schools, teeth dumped in the furnace, flesh dissolved in acid. He turned murder into profit. It's unknown how many died in that place. Holmes confessed to 27. Some say the real number is over 200. He was finally caught in 1894, not for murder, but for insurance fraud. Only when police searched the hotel did the truth crawl out from the walls. Bloodstains, bones, a woman's shoe, a child's toy, the stench of death in the ventilation system. Holmes was hanged in 1896. It took over 15 minutes for him to die. He requested to be buried in a coffin encased in concrete, afraid someone would dig him up and do to him what he had done to so many others. But the castle, it lived on for a while. After Holmes was arrested and hanged, the building stood quiet, but neighbors said it was anything but silent. People reported strange cries coming from inside at night, long after it was boarded up. Footsteps were heard pacing, stopping, and then pounding against the floor. Some swore they saw flickering lights in the upstairs windows, though there was no electricity. Years later, when the structure was briefly reopened as a post office, employees refused to go into the basement. They said it felt wrong down there, like the walls were breathing, watching. A few claimed to hear banging from behind sealed doors. One janitor quit after saying he saw a woman's face in a wall, eyes wide, mouth open as if screaming. Then it was gone. One night, a watchman ran screaming into the street. He swore he saw a man with sunken eyes and a crooked smile walking through the halls. The place was eventually abandoned, then burned. Some say it was arson. Others say the building killed itself. Paranormal investigators who visited the site before its demolition described it as one of the darkest places in America. Not just metaphorically. They said the air itself was heavy, suffocating. EVPs captured voices pleading, whispering, some even saying, "Don't go down there." One photo taken near the old stairwell shows a blurred figure, a man in a bowler hat, standing just out of focus, but no one remembers anyone being there. In 1938, a fire consumed much of the building. The cause? Never determined. Some said it was vandals. Others believed the building wanted to be destroyed. Even now, those who visit the site where a new structure stands report cold spots, dizziness, and nightmares the same night. And some people claim they've seen a tall man walking the sidewalk late at night. Sharp features, hat tilted low, always watching, always smiling. Today, nothing of the original castle remains. Just the stories and the memory of a man who designed a building where death had keys to every door. Because maybe H.H. Holmes didn't just build a castle for murder. Maybe he built himself a throne. And maybe, just maybe, he's still there, waiting behind a door that never opens, in a hallway that no longer exists, where the dead still whisper and the walls will never forget. Because the murder castle may be gone, but what happened there never left. A quiet campground in southern Oregon is the setting of our next unsolved murder. This is The Vanishing at Carberry Creek. They say the wilderness offers peace, a place to breathe, to disconnect, But there are corners of the forest that don't welcome visitors, places where the trees don't sway with the wind, because they're listening, where something waits, silent, watching, and once you enter, you may never leave the same. In the deep, forested shadows of southern Oregon's Siskiyou Mountains, there's a quiet campground near Carberry Creek, serene, remote, the kind of place where the only sound is the rustle of pine needles under your boots. In 1974, the Cowden family chose it for a peaceful Labor Day weekend. They never left. Richard Cowden was 28, a logging truck driver, clean-cut, dependable. He and his wife Belinda, 22, had 2 children, David, age 5, and Melissa, a baby just 5 months old. On August 30th, the family arrived at the campground in their pickup truck, parked it beneath the trees, and settled in. Locals remembered seeing them around town that weekend. They bought milk, chatted with shopkeepers. Nothing unusual. Then came September 1st. When Belinda's mother came to visit that evening, the campsite was eerily silent. The truck was still there. So were Richard's wallet, Belinda's purse, baby supplies, and even the milk they'd just bought, still unopened. A diaper bag lay next to a cold campfire. Nothing had been packed. Nothing was missing. It was like the family had vanished into the woods. Authorities searched the nearby forest for weeks. Helicopters scanned the tree canopy. Dogs traced and lost their scent. Not a single trace was found. No struggle, no footprints, no blood. Just silence. And then spring came. In April of 1975, 7 months later, 2 gold prospectors, hiking through a remote area, stumbled upon a gruesome discovery. Hidden in the mouth of a cave, partially concealed by stones, were the decomposed bodies of Belinda, David, and baby Melissa. Richard's body was found tied to a tree a short distance away. He had been shot in the head. Belinda and the children had been bludgeoned, killed in a frenzy of violence. The baby's remains were so fragile, it was difficult to determine what exactly had happened to her. Theories started swirling. Some believed the killer had stalked the family, watching them from the woods, that they were lured or forced away from the safety of their camp and then slaughtered. Others wondered if it was something stranger. A cult had been rumored in the area. Some said the family was part of a ritual, that the arrangement of their bodies, the remote location, felt too precise to be random. The most compelling theory pointed to a man named Dwayne Lee Little, a convicted murderer who had killed a young woman years earlier and who was free on parole at the time of the Cowden's disappearance. He was seen in the area that weekend. Investigators found a bullet near the crime scene that matched a gun Little had access to. And while in prison, a fellow inmate claimed Little confessed to murdering the Cowdens. But no charges were ever filed. Not enough evidence. Just more shadows. No fingerprints, no footprints, no one fleeing the scene. Just a meal left uneaten, a diaper bag in the grass, and a family erased. Today, the forest has taken much of the evidence back. The cave is quiet. The creek still runs cold. But locals say if you hike too far off the trail near Carberry Creek, sometimes you hear voices that don't belong. A child's laugh in the distance, a baby's soft cry, or the snap of a branch when no one's there. Because the forest remembers, and some places don't forgive trespassers. Our last story is a haunting disappearance, one so bizarre and disturbing, it changed the way law enforcement investigates missing adults. Forever. In the early hours of May 14, 2008, 19-year-old Brandon Swanson vanished without a trace on a rural road in western Minnesota, and the chilling mystery of that night has haunted investigators and his family ever since. Brandon had just completed his first year of college and was celebrating with friends in the small town of Canby. Around midnight, he left the party and began the 30-mile drive home to Marshall, Minnesota. At 1:54 a.m., his car became stuck in a ditch on a gravel road. Brandon, uninjured and calm, called his parents to come pick him up. He was sure he knew where he was, near Lind, a small town just north of Marshall. But when his parents drove to the location he described, they saw no sign of him. Brandon insisted he could see the lights of Lind in the distance. Frustrated but not panicked, he told his father he would walk toward the town and meet them there. They stayed on the phone for nearly 47 minutes as Brandon described passing landmarks and fences. Then he suddenly cried out, and the line went silent. His phone remained active for hours, but went unanswered. His parents, shaken, called police, but their concerns were initially brushed off. He was an adult. Maybe he had just wandered off. It wasn't until the next day that a proper search began. Authorities eventually found Brandon's car, not near Lind, but in Porter, a town 25 miles northwest of where he thought he was. It raised immediate questions. How could he have been so disoriented? And why did he say he saw lights from Lind, which wasn't remotely nearby? Bloodhounds traced his scent from the car to the edge of a nearby field, across gravel roads, and along a riverbank. But the trail abruptly ended. There was no sign of a struggle, no footprints, no personal belongings, nothing. Despite exhaustive searches, including the use of helicopters, divers, and sonar, no trace of Brandon has ever been found. There was no sign he entered the river, and if he had drowned, his body likely would have surfaced. Then came the theories. Some suspected foul play. Perhaps Brandon encountered someone along the road or near the field. Others believed he fell into a hidden well or sinkhole. Locals whispered about human trafficking, mistaken identity, or a rural crime that had been carefully covered up. The sudden exclamation as he cried out haunts the official case file. What did he see? What startled him? Years later, police acknowledged the possibility of something sinister, but without evidence, no charges were ever filed and no suspects named. His phone never turned on again. His bank account and social media remained untouched. The vast open fields of western Minnesota have swallowed many things: old barns, forgotten roads, pieces of time. But Brandon Swanson became something else, a name on a sign, a face in a photo, a ghost in the cornfields. Today, Brandon's law, named in his memory, requires law enforcement in Minnesota to begin immediate investigations when adults are reported missing under suspicious or dangerous circumstances. His parents still leave their porch light on every night. And somewhere out there, in the whispering dark of the Minnesota plains, the question lingers. What happened to Brandon Swanson that night? And who or what was with him when the line went dead? Some mysteries fade with time. Others grow darker, their shadows stretching into the present. The stories you've heard tonight are more than headlines. They're echoes of lives lost, justice delayed, and questions that may never be answered. But in the silence they leave behind, we listen, because the truth doesn't always stay buried. Thank you for joining me for this episode of Whispers After Dark, disturbing true crime audiobook stories. If these stories sent a chill down your spine, comment below. Tell us about a story you would like to hear. Be sure to check out our other story collections and illustrated short stories. Make sure to subscribe, like, and tap the notification bell so you never miss what waits in the shadows. Until then, stay curious, stay cautious, and beware of the whispers after dark.